Picture this. It's 1994 in San Antonio, Texas. 4 young women, friends, co-workers, living their lives quietly in a working-class neighborhood, are about to have their world completely shattered by an accusation so devastating it would steal 20 years of their lives. Elizabeth Ramirez, just 20 years old. Cassandra Rivera, 18. Christy Mayhew, 19. Ana Vasquez, 17. 4 friends who had no idea that a summer babysitting arrangement would lead to what experts now call one of the most egregious wrongful convictions in Texas history. These women, all openly gay in a time and place where that made them targets, would be branded as monsters, convicted of crimes they didn't commit, and sent to prison based on testimony that modern science has completely debunked. But this isn't just a story about a broken justice system. It's about how prejudice, panic, and the desperation to believe children can create a perfect storm of injustice. It's about prosecutors who used sexual orientation as evidence of guilt. It's about medical experts who saw abuse where none existed, and it's about 4 women who refused to give up, even when the entire world seemed convinced of their guilt. Welcome to the devastating case of the San Antonio 4, where being different in 1990s Texas was enough to destroy your life. Background context. To understand how this nightmare began, we need to go back to 1994 San Antonio and understand both the women themselves and the dangerous climate they were living in. Elizabeth Ramirez was the oldest at 20, working at a local Payless shoe store and trying to build an independent life. She was openly gay and living with her girlfriend, something that required courage in 1990s Texas. Her 3 friends formed a tight-knit group in their predominantly Hispanic working-class community on the south side of San Antonio. Cassandra Rivera worked at a Pizza Hut. Christy Mayhew was employed at a local apartment complex. Ana Vasquez, the youngest at 17, was still in high school. These weren't women living on society's margins. They had jobs, families, and community connections. But they were openly gay in a time and place where that made them automatic outsiders. The summer of 1994 seemed ordinary enough. Elizabeth's 2 young nieces, daughters of her half-sister Rosemary, came to stay with her while their mother worked. The girls were 7 and 9 years old, and this wasn't unusual. Elizabeth often helped with child care, and her friends would come over to help watch the children. It was a normal family arrangement in a community where extended family support was common. But 1994, America was in the grip of something historians now call the Satanic Panic. A moral hysteria that had been building since the 1980s. Across the country, daycare workers, teachers, and family members found themselves accused of elaborate ritual abuse conspiracies. The McMartin preschool case in California had made headlines for years. The Fells Acres case in Massachusetts had sent multiple people to prison. These cases shared common elements: allegations of satanic rituals, bizarre sexual acts, and elaborate conspiracies involving multiple perpetrators. Child protection experts, prosecutors, and therapists genuinely believed they were uncovering a massive underground network of abuse. We now know that most of these cases were built on false memories implanted through flawed interview techniques, but in 1994, they seemed terrifyingly real. Texas had seen its own share of these cases. The Children of God cult had operated in the state. The Branch Davidian compound in Waco had burned just a year earlier. There was a genuine fear that satanic cults were targeting children throughout the state. Into this atmosphere of fear and suspicion came 4 young women who were already viewed with suspicion by much of their community. They were gay, they were young, and they were different. In the moral panic climate of 1994, being different made you dangerous. The stage was set for a perfect storm of injustice that would consume 4 lives and expose the darkest impulses of the American justice system. Timeline of events. The nightmare began in late July 1994, but the seeds were planted earlier that summer. Elizabeth's nieces, let's call them Maria and Sophia to protect their privacy, had been staying with Elizabeth periodically throughout the summer months. According to Elizabeth, everything was completely normal. The girls played games, watched television, and spent time with Elizabeth and her friends like any typical family situation. But there was tension in the extended family that would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. Elizabeth's relationship with her half-sister Rosemary had been strained, particularly after Elizabeth came out as gay. Rosemary disapproved of Elizabeth's lifestyle and had expressed concerns about her daughter spending time in Elizabeth's home. This family conflict would later provide a motive that investigators completely ignored. When the girls returned to their grandmother's house in late July, something had changed dramatically. 7-year-old Sophia began exhibiting sexualized behavior that immediately alarmed the adults around her. She was acting out sexually with other children and making inappropriate comments. When questioned about where she had learned these behaviors, she made an accusation that would destroy 4 lives. She claimed that Elizabeth and her friends had sexually abused her and her older sister. The accusation escalated with terrifying speed. The girls were immediately taken to Methodist Hospital for medical examinations. What happened next reveals how fundamentally flawed our understanding of child abuse evidence was in the 1990s. Dr. Michael Mao, the pediatrician who examined the girls, claimed to find physical evidence of sexual abuse. He identified what he said were scars and injuries consistent with violent sexual assault, including what he described as evidence of penetration. This medical testimony would later prove to be completely wrong, but in 1994, it seemed like ironclad proof of the children's claims. Dr. Mao's findings were presented as scientific fact, and they gave prosecutors the physical evidence they needed to build their case. But the children's stories didn't stop with simple accusations of abuse. Under repeated questioning by investigators, therapists, and family members, their accounts grew increasingly elaborate and bizarre. They described satanic rituals performed in Elizabeth's apartment. They claimed the women had forced them to drink blood and urine. They said they had been threatened with knives and guns. They described orgies involving multiple adults and other children. These details, now recognized by experts as classic signs of false memory implantation from leading questions, were taken as evidence of an even more sinister crime. The more outlandish the allegations became, the more convinced investigators grew that they were dealing with a satanic cult conspiracy. The questioning techniques used were everything we now know not to do when interviewing child witnesses. The girls were interviewed multiple times by different people. They were asked leading questions that suggested specific answers. They were praised when they provided the right details and encouraged to remember more. Each interview session produced new and more elaborate accusations. Law enforcement moved quickly to make arrests. Elizabeth Ramirez was taken into custody first in November 1994. The arrest was dramatic. Police surrounded her workplace and arrested her in front of her co-workers and customers. The local media coverage was immediate and devastating. Headlines screamed about a lesbian satanic cult, and Elizabeth's photograph was plastered across newspapers and television screens. Her 3 friends were arrested over the following months as the investigation expanded. Cassandra Rivera was arrested in December 1994. Christy Mayhew and Anna Vasquez were taken into custody in early 1995. Each arrest generated fresh media coverage, with prosecutors painting a picture of 4 women who had formed some kind of homosexual conspiracy to abuse children. The women were held in the Bexar County Jail, where they faced immediate threats from other inmates who viewed them as child abusers. They were placed in protective custody for their own safety, spending months in isolation while awaiting trial. The prosecutorial theory was that these 4 women had formed a satanic lesbian cult dedicated to abusing children. District Attorney Susan Reed's office argued that their homosexuality was evidence of their deviant nature and their willingness to commit unspeakable acts. The prosecution team included some of the most experienced prosecutors in the district attorney's office, who treated this as one of the most serious cases they had ever handled. Elizabeth Ramirez went to trial first, in September 1997. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the children's testimony and Dr. Mao's medical findings. The children, now several years older, testified in detail about the alleged abuse. Their testimony was dramatic and emotional, describing horrific acts of violence and sexual abuse. Elizabeth's sexuality was front and center throughout the trial. Prosecutors argued that her homosexual lifestyle made her more likely to abuse children. They presented evidence of her relationship with her girlfriend and suggested that gay women were inherently dangerous to children. Defense attorneys struggled against this wall of prejudice and the seemingly solid medical evidence. The trial lasted several weeks, but the outcome seemed predetermined. Elizabeth was convicted on 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault of a child and sentenced to 37.5 years in prison. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read, with family members of the alleged victims celebrating while Elizabeth's supporters wept. Her 3 friends watched this unfold from jail and made a devastating decision that would haunt them for years. Faced with the prospect of similar lengthy sentences and seeing how Elizabeth's trial had gone, they accepted plea deals in 1998. Their attorneys advised them that fighting the charges would likely result in convictions and sentences as harsh as Elizabeth's. Cassandra Rivera, Christy Mayhew, and Ana Vasquez each pleaded no contest to charges of aggravated sexual assault of a child. They received sentences of 15 years each. But here's the crucial detail that reveals their true innocence. Even while accepting these pleas to avoid trial and potentially harsher sentences, all 3 women maintained their innocence. They refused to admit guilt as part of their plea agreements, instead entering what's called an Alford plea, acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict them while maintaining they had done nothing wrong. This distinction is important because it shows these women were willing to go to prison rather than falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit. If they had been guilty, accepting responsibility as part of a plea deal would have likely resulted in shorter sentences. By 1999, all 4 women were behind bars in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Elizabeth Ramirez was serving nearly 4 decades at the Mountain View Unit, a maximum security women's prison. Her 3 friends were scattered across different facilities, each serving 15-year sentences. Their families were devastated. Elizabeth's young son, who had been just a toddler when she was arrested, grew up visiting his mother in prison. The women lost jobs, relationships, and their places in their community. Friends and family members were torn between loyalty and doubt. Some believed in their innocence, but others were convinced by the weight of the evidence and the horror of the allegations. The community largely believed justice had been served. 4 dangerous predators were off the streets, and 2 little girls had been protected from further harm. The case was closed, the women were forgotten, and life moved on. But for Elizabeth Ramirez, Cassandra Rivera, Christy Mayhew, and Ana Vasquez, this was just the beginning of a 20-year fight to prove their innocence and reclaim their lives. Investigation details. The investigation that would eventually free the San Antonio Four began not with law enforcement, but with changing science, evolving understanding of child psychology, and the determination of families who never stopped believing in their innocence. For years, the women languished in prison with little hope. Appeals failed. Habeas corpus petitions were denied. The legal system had spoken, and it seemed final. Elizabeth Ramirez spent her days in maximum security, watching other inmates come and go while her own release date remained decades away. But slowly, cracks began to appear in the case that had seemed so solid in the 1990s. The first major development came from an unexpected source: changes in medical understanding of child abuse evidence. By the mid-2000s, pediatric experts had begun questioning many of the medical findings that had convicted people during the Satanic Panic era. Research showed that many physical signs previously thought to indicate abuse were actually normal anatomical variations or the result of other causes. The medical evidence that had seemed so convincing in the 1990s was being systematically debunked. In 2010, advocates for the women convinced Dr. Nancy Kellogg, a nationally recognized pediatric child abuse expert at UT Health San Antonio, to review the original medical evidence in the case. Dr. Kellogg's findings were shocking. There was no evidence of sexual abuse. The scarring and injuries that Dr. Mao had identified as proof of violent assault were actually normal anatomical variations that occur in many children. Dr. Kellogg's review was devastating to the prosecution's case. She found that Dr. Mao had misidentified normal tissue as scars, had seen signs of abuse where none existed, and had reached conclusions that were not supported by the medical evidence. The physical evidence that had convinced the jury of the women's guilt was completely wrong. But the medical evidence was just the beginning. The Innocence Project of Texas, led by attorneys Mike Ware and Allison Clayton, took up the case and began a comprehensive investigation. They brought in additional medical experts who confirmed Dr. Kellogg's findings. Dr. Amy Lindberg, another pediatric expert, testified that she found no evidence whatsoever of sexual abuse in the medical records. Dr. Antonia Chiesa, a child abuse pediatrician, reviewed the case and concluded that the original medical findings were not only wrong, but represented a fundamental misunderstanding of normal child anatomy. The Innocence Project team also uncovered evidence of how the children's testimonies had been contaminated through flawed interview techniques. They brought in Dr. Maggie Bruck, a leading expert on children's memory and testimony, who analyzed the original interviews and found numerous problems. The children had been interviewed multiple times by different people, with each interview becoming more elaborate and detailed. They had been asked leading questions that suggested specific answers. They had been praised for providing certain details and encouraged to remember more. This pattern is a classic sign of false memory implantation, not genuine recall of traumatic events. Dr. Bruck's analysis showed that the interview techniques used in the 1990s were precisely the methods now known to create false memories in children. The more the children were questioned, the more elaborate their stories became. Not because they were remembering more details, but because they were unconsciously creating new memories to satisfy their questioners. The investigation also uncovered evidence of how prejudice had influenced the original proceedings. The women's sexuality had been used against them in ways that would likely be considered prosecutorial misconduct today. Prosecutors had argued that being gay made them more likely to abuse children, a claim with no scientific basis that played into harmful stereotypes. Legal experts found that the satanic panic context had made the bizarre accusations seem credible when they should have been red flags for false allegations. Cases from the same era with similar elements, ritual abuse, multiple perpetrators, elaborate conspiracies, had been systematically overturned as our understanding of false memories improved. Then came the breakthrough that would change everything. In 2012, one of the alleged victims, now in her 20s, came forward with a stunning revelation. Stephanie Lyman Martinez, who had been 9 years old at the time of the alleged abuse, recanted her testimony entirely. In a sworn affidavit, she admitted that the abuse had never occurred. She explained that she had been pressured and coached into making the accusations as a child. She described how adults had repeatedly questioned her until she told them what they wanted to hear. Most damning of all, she revealed that the original accusations had been motivated by family disputes and her mother's anger at Elizabeth's homosexuality. Stephanie's recantation was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it was also deeply personal. She described years of guilt and trauma from knowing that 4 innocent women were in prison because of her childhood testimony. She had carried this burden into adulthood, and finally coming forward was both an act of courage and an attempt at redemption. The recantation provided the final piece of the puzzle that advocates needed. They now had medical evidence showing no abuse had occurred, expert testimony about contaminated child interviews, and one of the alleged victims admitting the accusations were false. The Innocence Project built a comprehensive case showing that every piece of evidence against the San Antonio Four was either fabricated, contaminated, or misunderstood. But overturning wrongful convictions is an uphill battle, especially when they're decades old and the original evidence seemed so compelling. Resolution: current status. The fight for justice took years of legal battles, but persistence finally paid off. The first breakthrough came in 2013 when Ana Vasquez was released on parole after serving 12.5 years of her 15-year sentence. Her release was conditional. She still had to register as a sex offender and faced numerous restrictions on her freedom. But she was finally out of prison. Ana immediately became a tireless advocate for her 3 friends still behind bars. She spoke at rallies, gave interviews to journalists, and worked with the Innocence Project to keep pressure on the legal system. Her freedom gave the case new visibility and momentum. The legal pressure continued to mount throughout 2013. The combination of the medical evidence, the expert testimony about false memories, and Stephanie's recantation created an overwhelming case for the women's innocence. In November 2013, a judge ruled that Elizabeth Ramirez, Cassandra Rivera, and Christy Mayhew should be released on bond while their cases proceeded through the appeals process. After 15 years in prison, Elizabeth walked out of the Mountain View unit on Thanksgiving week 2013. The reunion with her son, now 18 years old, was emotional and heartbreaking. She had missed his entire childhood, his first steps, his first day of school, his graduation. Those were years that could never be recovered. Cassandra and Christy were released shortly after. All 4 women were finally free, though not yet officially exonerated. They still faced the stigma of their convictions and the ongoing legal battle to clear their names completely. The wait for final vindication continued for 3 more years. The case moved through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals while the women tried to rebuild their lives. They faced enormous challenges, finding employment with criminal records, dealing with the trauma of wrongful imprisonment, and navigating a world that had changed dramatically during their incarceration. The final victory came in November 2016 when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals declared all 4 women actually innocent, not just that their convictions were overturned, but that they were factually innocent of the crimes. This distinction was crucial because it meant they were eligible for compensation from the state and that their names would be completely cleared. The court's ruling was comprehensive and damning to the original prosecution. It found that the medical evidence was false and misleading, that the children's testimony was unreliable due to improper interviewing techniques, and that the women had been convicted based on evidence that was probably false. In 2018, their records were finally expunged, officially erasing their convictions from the books. The state of Texas agreed to pay each woman compensation for their wrongful imprisonment. Elizabeth Ramirez received $2.9 million for her 17 years behind bars, approximately $170,000 for each year of her life that was stolen. Her 3 friends received compensation based on their time served, but money couldn't give them back what they had lost. Elizabeth had missed watching her son grow up. All 4 women had lost careers, relationships, and irreplaceable time with their families. They had endured years of imprisonment, stigma, and trauma. The compensation was acknowledgement of the injustice, but it couldn't undo the damage. The case became a landmark example of wrongful conviction, studied by legal experts and featured in the award-winning documentary Southwest of Salem, the story of the San Antonio Four. The film brought national attention to their story and helped educate the public about the dangers of false accusations and prejudice in the justice system. Reflection Impact. The San Antonio Four case serves as a devastating reminder of how prejudice can poison justice and destroy innocent lives. These women weren't just victims of bad science or overzealous prosecution. They were systematically targeted because of who they were. Their sexuality was weaponized against them in a way that seems almost unthinkable today, but was tragically common in the 1990s. The case exposed multiple failures in the justice system. Prosecutors used sexual orientation as evidence of guilt. Medical experts testified to findings that were completely wrong. Child protection workers used interview techniques that created false memories. Defense attorneys struggled against a wall of prejudice and seemingly solid evidence. Judges and juries accepted theories that had no basis in science or logic. But the case also demonstrates the power of persistence and changing knowledge. As our understanding of child psychology, medical evidence, and false memories evolved, it became possible to see the truth that had been hidden for decades. The Innocence Project's work on this case helped establish new standards for evaluating historical child abuse convictions. The impact extends far beyond these 4 women. Their case helped change how we understand child testimony, medical evidence in abuse cases, and the dangers of moral panic prosecutions. It highlighted the particular vulnerabilities faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in the criminal justice system and helped establish legal precedents for challenging discriminatory prosecutions. Today, all 4 women are advocates for criminal justice reform and wrongful conviction awareness. Elizabeth Ramirez has become a powerful speaker about the need for better training for prosecutors and judges. Ana Vasquez works with organizations supporting other wrongfully convicted individuals. Their story is taught in law schools as an example of how prejudice and flawed science can create miscarriages of justice. The San Antonio Four lost 23 years of their collective lives to fear, prejudice, and systemic failure. But their fight for justice has helped ensure that future defendants might not face the same fate. Their courage in maintaining their innocence, even when it seemed hopeless, ultimately helped expose one of the most egregious wrongful convictions in American history. Their story reminds us that the justice system is only as fair as the people who operate it, and that vigilance against prejudice and rush to judgment is essential to preventing future tragedies. In a world where difference is still too often seen as dangerous, the San Antonio Four's vindication offers hope that truth and justice can ultimately prevail.